Welcome to Channel AMAC, your insight to the Australian visa system. Good day everyone, my name is Carl Young, your online YouTube visa consultant. Are you interested about migrating to Australia? Why don't you consider to subscribe to my channel and turn on a little bell on the side. So once we have all the news and updates, you'll be the first one getting all the insight. Now obviously my channel do not just talk about the regulatory requirement, but sometimes of some news and updates and useful thinking tools and tactics in regards to visas and study abroad in Australia. So a little bit different towards in compared to all the other channels out there, which they have also done a very good channel and contents. Now today's video is all about another news, very interesting, which I've read last night. Thinking it's good to actually share with everyone as a fan of this channel. Obviously we know that the election's coming up towards the end of this week, so it's very tight. The two major parties is throwing a lot of stuff and a lot of money, promises. Well, whichever wins, don't know. Obviously, I've cast my vote yesterday. See how it goes by the end of this week. And it will affect, obviously, the future of Australian migration policies, which I predicted, and I think, whether or not whichever party will actually be ruling in the coming future, the migration policy will always be an open door for a lot of migrants. And obviously, in the post-pandemic era, it will play a very vital as a key point to move Australia into the future. Now let's have a read about this news. It's interesting, coming from the Consultation, which is academic, some sort of, and the news came out yesterday, 4:54 a.m. Wow, these editors really work quite hard. They publish stuff while we are all in sleep. Now let's read the title. Says Australia is bringing migrant workers back, but exploitation is still rampant. Here are 3 changes needed now. So looks like as Australia's border is now open, obviously more and more migrants, whether it's going to be temporary or permanent, will come into Australia. And remember, back early last year, there was a parliamentary committee where the government and obviously all the members of parliament is looking towards some sort of revamp and change to the employment work-related visa, make it much more easier. However, we haven't seen any policy yet. Now obviously it's because of election. Now election actually prevents a lot of policy to be announced, obviously, because they don't want to announce it and affect the election in a way which they cannot predict, because it can be positive, it can be negative as well. No politician will want to gamble that during the election campaign. So don't know, but looks like this trend is coming. So more migrant workers is required to be in Australia, and it's a fact. It's a need and demand. If you have friends or relatives in Australia, you notice that everywhere is in skill shortage, coming from supermarket, restaurant, all the way to the high tech and the big corporation. They all seeking for skilled workers and professionals, but they just cannot locate them because they are elsewhere around the world. So it's a competition. There was so many media and articles talking about how Australia's immigration policy isn't attractive enough. So obviously then they can make it more attractive. All right, let's have a read about this one. This is more about migrant workers' rights. I think it's good. It's a fair say. They are providing more. They're looking to actually have more channel to allow the migrant worker to have more fair right for their says, not affecting their visa. But I think it's a very tough part to actually play in a sense. But see how that goes. So let's have a read. If the COVID year has taught us anything about migration, it is Australia's depends on it. Well, that's very, very factual. I think that first sentence is straight to the right point, and which is what I have actually predicted and said for the past 2 years. And about 7% of our workforce holds temporary visa when many international student backpackers and other temporary visa holders suddenly left during COVID, and ensuring staff shortage reveal how vital these workers are to Australian workforce. Well, look, this is the fact. Look, back in 2019, Scott Morrison and the party were pitching there were too many migrants, remember? So they decreased the actual annual intake from 190,000 down to 160,000. And on the 20th of March 2020, due to pandemic, they asked everybody to go home. Now we got all these problems. So the current party seeking for a new agriculture visa, which the Labor opposed to that by extending Pacific Australian Labour Mobility Scheme, which I don't think there's too much of differences there, and allowing international students to work unlimited hours. Whether or not that's going to be continued, we don't know, and see how that goes. But the government elect on May 21st, whichever party is going to be LNP or Labour, will inherit the Australian legacies of entrenched wage theft. Well, I haven't really seen too much of these kind of things, but obviously I know it's a fact that's happening everywhere around Australia, but not in the big corporation, but more in the small and medium-sized sectors. A recent open letter signed by the 14 legal service provider, church, and other advocacy organisations across Australia has called on government to enact 3 key reforms to address this issue. So first one is enable migrant workers to act against exploitation employer by providing effective visa protection. Now it's going to be quite hard, I think, this one for my comment here. Why? Well, look, so literally a migrant worker can come, and if they're not happy about the employer, they'll be protected, and they will put a lot of complaint, and that will probably have adverse response by the employer, and the employer will be somehow more lack in seeking for overseas workers, wouldn't they? They don't want trouble, right? But I don't know how that will go. Number 2, implement an efficient, accessible, inexpensive claim process for worker to promptly recover their wage and entitlements. Well, I think that's already been. I'm not too sure how Fair Work Ombudsman will be an expensive way to claim that, but I think that mechanism is already there. However, whether or not they're going to make it easier and cheaper and easier to be accessible, don't know. Okay, number 3, extend fair entitlements guarantee to employee to temporary visa scheme last resort, provide unpaid employee entitled when an employer become insolvent. Well, that's a very good one, because during pandemic, there's so many employer went insolvent, and those sponsored employee and nowhere to go, and they cannot apply for any other visas elsewhere. I think this one will be very good, but I doubt how number 1, the first item, can be actually implemented, because wouldn't that adversely affect the employer's willingness to actually get more employees overseas? We don't know, especially for small, medium-sized businesses. But of course, we wanted to protect the employees. But could the employee exploit the opportunity in making complaint with the protection visa, or not protection visa, visa protection, in a way to go against the employer? You see, that's how do we balance that? That's the hard part. That is the very hard part to balancing that. Now, moving forward, the theft of migrant worker wages rampant. Over 8,000 survey. Now, these are international students between 2016 and 19, consistently found that majority were underpaid. Now, that's for students, and how the student could actually lodge well, they can lodge farewell ombudsman, but some of them don't even looking to actually do that. A March 2022 Senate committee examined unlawful and underpayment employee, described problem as systematic, sustained, and shameful. Allowed to be continued, and what's happening, because I think this the balance there. Look, all the democratic country, they have elections, so the voters will the employer will have the voting right. Now, obviously, migrant workers don't have any voting right. So what will the government or the politician do? Of course, they listen to someone who have the vote right, and go for them, right? So that's how it has been allowed to continue. Exploitation flourish because regulators do not routinely detect or punish labor law. I think it's just gonna be very, very hard. Now, for a newly arrived migrant, for example, international student, they wouldn't even know any kind of law unless they are law specialists. And how would a student with a young age be a law specialist, a legal specialist, understand this kind of stuff? They probably wouldn't know, and they probably wouldn't even know back home in their originated country as well. So they need to be educated as well. But again, we gotta treat it in a balance, not allowing employee utilizing this as a weapon to adversely affect the business sector there as well. So these are some of the samples of Sophia being her employer unlawfully demand to repay part of her wage, unwittingly committed migration offense. This could result in cancellation of visa. You heard all these kind of stories. And also, the Farewell Ombudsman has an agreement with the Immigration Department that worker reporting exploitation likely will not lose their visa. Well, it's actually quite hard because under the regulation, look, if the employer is not willing to sponsor you anymore, well, by conducting some unlawful conducts, which possibly asking for wage to be paid back, well, that's unlawful, that's fine. But if the visa holder doesn't have a sponsor anymore, that means the visa is gone under the regulation. How do you get that protected? Don't know. And what is the period they're being protected? Are they allowed to go out to seek for further employer? And look, you've been through my video about employment visas. It's so complicated. Even if you got a new employer willing to sponsor you, the procedure wise required is a lot. They need to put 3 job ads for at least 4 weeks, put in recruitment data, noting that they cannot find a local and wanting to sponsor. Then they need to put in a standard business sponsorship done, nomination done, and pay for that skilling Australian fund, well, costing about almost like 10,000. Would they willing to do that? And what if this employee come back and complain to this another new employer? See, that problem goes on and on. So I don't think it's an easy way to get this resolved. Seizing the moment, the next government needs to make choice. In the first opinion, seize a moment where there's still relatively low number of migrant workers in Australia to fix the part of system enable wage theft. Yes, they can be fixed, but if we make it too hard, it will probably disallow all the employers to actually get more people to come in, because the consequences is too painful, isn't it? Obviously, the employer shouldn't exploit that kind of thing, or taking money away from the employee. That's the wrong part. But would the employee using that against the employer? That's probably another story, and that's potentially will happen. If you do that, that will happen, because that's already been happening. But it's just because the employer had done the wrong thing. But if the employer didn't do anything wrong, but the employee is seeking to do something wrong, that's another. Anyway, so we need to balance all that up. But I'm actually for this kind of policy, because that's more protective. protect all the employee, because the employee is somehow more vulnerable compared to employer. However, an employee in Australia in another way is also vulnerable as well. Well, I mean small size business owners. But how can they actually balance this one? I'm not talking about big corporation would not have this kind of issues anyway. They pay the right pay, they pay high wages, they get all these high experienced professional. But what about a small medium-sized business? They pay the average wage. And how would they survive and during a pandemic? Okay, so that's another thing. Okay, curbing force of labor and modern slavery. This modern slavery has become one of the phrases that they use in political gain. But how can that actually be resolved? In 2019, the whole of Government Migrant Worker Task Force made 22 detailed recommendations. Government now support all the recommendation. Have they been implemented? Well, if they have done the implementations, would that actually make an employment sponsor visa even harder, or perhaps make it simpler? Probably, I don't know. It seems to be it's gonna be making it harder for employer to comply, and more step to be done. And so if I'm gonna employ an overseas worker with more complexity to be complied with, compared to if I employ someone who is local, Australian citizen, Australian permanent resident, and I don't have to deal with all these procedural problems. Not problem, I mean, it's time consuming. Well, not the employer wanted to do that anymore. Don't know. Obviously, we are in the extreme era of our time because of pandemic. But what about when life goes back to normal? Anyway, should you have more question, query, more than welcome to leave a comment right down below. And I see you next video. Goodbye.